The great horse racing columnist for the Daily Racing Form, named Joe Hirsch, took me under his wing and taught me so much more that I did not know about horse racing. The great Joe Hirsch, coincidentally, had been Joe Namath's roommate when Joe first came to New York out of the University of Alabama. And Joe had gotten and remained big brother close to Joe Namath. The story was that Sonny Werblin, who owned the Jets at that time, knew that Joe Namath loved to party and feared that Namath would quickly party his way into oblivion in the Big Apple. And he knew, Sonny Werblin did, that he needed a big brother roommate to steer him clear of the big trouble, the fatal trouble. Werblin knew that Joe Hirsch was the toast of the town. He knew everybody who was anybody in Manhattan. He knew the ins and he knew the potentially dangerous outs. So Werblin had entrusted Namath to Hirsch, Joe to Joe. But now in 1977, Namath's career had floundered, had been cut short, really ravaged by knee injuries before there were surgeries that could actually fix ACL tears. Still, LA Rams owner at the time, Carroll Rosenblum, showman that he was, man about town that he was, wanted to be able to rub elbows with and ultimately sell Broadway Joe to LA Rams fans. Trust me, knees or no knees, Joe Namath was still the biggest name in the National Football League at this point. And so, because of my relationship with Joe Hirsch, I had an in with Joe Namath as Carroll Rosenblum acquired him to come west to LA. Quick aside, quick story. This is way before cell phones, voicemails, no voicemails. So the guy who answered the phones at the LA Times in those days, in the sports department, would leave notes on our desk to call back so-and-so. My wife and I had just ordered a couch from a department store that used to be big out here in LA called the Broadway. So the note left on my desk was, Broadway called, on the way. People walking by my desk lost their minds, thinking, we got to find Skip because Namath's on his way, and we got the story, and Skip's got to write the story, which led to an embarrassing moment that actually pales in comparison to what I'm about to impart to you. When Joe Namath did arrive, he immediately made it clear to the media out here in LA he had no use for any reporters, local or national. He would do no interviews with nobody. Yet after his first preseason game at the Coliseum, I worked up my courage. I walked up to him as he sat alone in front of his locker, and I introduced myself. And he lit right up like I was a long-lost relative, and he said, "Oh, you're Joe's guy." Me and Joe Hirsch. "It's great to finally meet you. Let me know what I can do for you, man." Joe Namath said that to me. Joe Namath gave me several exclusive interviews that season. Really helped me. He was great to me. But the sad truth was he was not great on the football field. He started 4 early games that season. Threw for 141, then 136, then 126, and in his final game is a Monday night game at Chicago. He threw for 203, but that was on 16 of 40 passes with no touchdowns and 4 interceptions, and the Rams lost 24-23. Do the math. That was the last game Joe Namath ever played. For the Rams, that season ended with a 14-7 home playoff loss to the Vikings. It was a mud bowl of a game, rare rain out here in Southern California. The Rams quarterback that day was Pat Hayden, the former USC Golden Boy, who had about half of Joe Namath's arm. But the next day, I was assigned to do a Rams wrap-up story for the Times. So I drove all the way down to their facility down in Long Beach, maybe an hour south of where I lived. I wandered into a mostly empty locker room, and there was Joe Namath with a duffel bag clearing out his locker. And I walked up and said, "You aren't leaving us, are you?" He said, "Yep, I'm done." I said, "Done as in retired?" I mean, that would be news. "Yep," he said. So, of course, I asked if I could ask him just a few questions, and he said, "Well, sure," but said he had to run an errand and asked me to meet him at a local bar there in Long Beach in about an hour. Upscale bar, what we used to call a fern bar, if you will. So I frantically called my sports editor at the Times, put him on alert. He said, "I'll call you right back." He did, told me that the decks have been cleared on A1. I'm talking about the front page of the LA Times, not the front of the sports, the front page of the LA Times, which in those days had the biggest circulation in the country. I mean, for me to have Joe Namath retiring scoop, that's put it in bold headlines. That was going to lead the paper the next day. So all of a sudden, for me to make a 5 o'clock deadline, I would have to interview him on the fly at the Fern Bar. I would have to scribble out the story in longhand, and then I would have to actually dictate it from a payphone, probably there in the bar, to make a 5 o'clock deadline, because the odds of trying to drive from Long Beach all the way back up to downtown Los Angeles to go type the story in the sports department of the LA Times would take, I don't know, at that hour, an hour and a half, maybe, if I was lucky. Ugh. Nope, I was going to have to do it the hard way. And that way got a little harder when I walked into the Fern Bar and noticed that Joe Namath was already surrounded by maybe a dozen friends at 3 or 4 tables that had been pushed together out in the middle of the bar. What? I mean, I thought this was one-on-one, and now it's one on a dozen. But Joe had saved a seat for me right next to him. Appreciated that. Yet now I was going to have to try interviewing Namath at his, what had come clear was his retirement party, as he interacted across the table with his guests, and the booze was flowing. This was obviously not ideal. This was very scary, because I'm thinking my career might hinge on me able to follow through with the story that I had promised, that they were holding A1 for. Waitress popped over, asked me what I was drinking, and I, without even thinking, said red wine. So she quickly plunked down, full glass beside me, red wine, and I began to try to interview Joe Namath as I nervously sipped my red wine. Deadline clock was ticking, and I was struggling to keep Joe's mind on what I was asking, to keep him on point with his answers as he exchanged banter back and forth across the table. I couldn't blame him for that, but stay with me, Joe, stay with me. Namath had already had a couple of drinks, and as you might guess, the cautionary irony here was that about 25 years after this moment, he would be forced to face and to conquer his alcoholism after trying to kiss ESPN's Susie Colbert during a live national TV interview. But on this night, I didn't even notice. I had sipped my glass of red wine to the bottom, and boom, the waitress plunked down another full glass. I sipped and scribbled, as Joe intermittently answered my questions. Clock ticked. After maybe half hour of trying and often failing to extract little bits and pieces of quotes, I finally thanked Joe Namath and told him I had to run. By this point, I had sipped my second glass of red wine nearly to the bottom. I pushed back my chair and I stood to shake hands with Joe Namath and to wish him well. And as God is my witness, I felt myself falling straight backward into the poor man sitting behind me, who actually helped break my fall. But even as I tried to grab onto this poor fellow, I could not keep from falling. I'm falling. I could feel myself going down, fortunately to the carpeted floor. I wound up on my back, looking up into the face of Broadway Joe. Now, if you might remember, he grew up in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, but while playing at Alabama for Bear Bryant, Joe had somehow acquired a Southern accent. So Joe Willie Namath peered into my eyes and said to me, "Son, you're drunk." What? Me? Drunk? It's impossible. So I tried to stand up and I realized my legs were rubber, dangerously wobbly. Joe grabbed my right arm and held on and said, "You cannot drive right now." I was drunk. I had no tolerance for alcohol because I barely had more than a sip. 2 glasses of red wine had done to me what I've so often seen vodka and bourbon do to my parents. Joe helped me all the way to the payphone near the bar's entrance. No cell phones. And I thanked him, maybe overly profusely. Maybe I gushed. And he returned to his party. Now I had to make one of the most difficult phone calls of my life to my sports editor, Bill Shirley, who had become like a father to me. Bill was straight-laced, arch-conservative from Little Rock, Arkansas, and he was under the distinct impression I did not drink at all. And of course, he was eagerly awaiting my front page exclusive bombshell story on Joe Namath's retirement. Fortunately, my speech was not slurred. At least I don't think it was. But I did heave a sigh and I said, "Bill, you're not going to believe this, but I'm drunk." And I quickly told him the story of how it happened. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. And finally, Bill Shirley said to me, "How confident are you that nobody else has this story?" Our extremely competitive and aggressive competition in those days was the LA Herald Examiner. They did a great job, and I did fear them as much as respect them. Yet I said to Bill Shirley, "I'm 99.9% sure I'm the only one who has the story. And Bill told me to go find some coffee, which I didn't drink, and try to walk it off for a couple of hours, then to drive home after rush hour, to be in the office the next morning at 9 a.m. sharp, to write the story that we wouldn't have to rush with for the following day's newspaper. And that's exactly what I did. In fact, I ended up walking across the street from the Fern Bar to a mall. I did loops around the mall. I hated coffee. I hate the taste of coffee even worse than alcohol. So I just drank Coke for the caffeine in Coke to sober me up. The story did wind up running across the top of the front page, but it was only of the front page the following day of the sports section, but that was fine with me, not the front page of the newspaper. But nobody else beat me to my big exclusive. I had it. Bill Shirley was extremely pleased with it and never ever asked me another word about being drunk. But since that night that I did get drunk with Broadway Joe, not one drop of alcohol has passed my lips. Not one drop. No more red wine. No, nothing. Not one drop. Who knows? Maybe that night saved me from my double genetic predisposition to alcoholism. Thank you, Broadway Joe. I will never, ever forget your immortal line to me. Son, you're drunk. I hope you enjoyed that video. You ready for more? Make sure you click that subscribe button for all the exclusive content from the Skip Bayless Show. And don't forget to check out the full episode of the show wherever you get your podcasts by clicking the link in the description.